Number 1. Anthony Kirkland, the serial killer whose case forced Ohio to reconsider its death penalty appeals process and shocked Cincinnati to its core. Anthony Kirkland was born on September 13, 1968, in the impoverished neighborhoods of Cincinnati, Ohio, where systemic neglect and trauma would shape a trajectory toward unfathomable violence. By the time authorities finally apprehended him in 2009, Kirkland had murdered 5 people, with his final 2 victims being teenage girls whose disappearances would expose critical failures in how Ohio tracked violent offenders and handled parole decisions. His case began not with those final murders, however, but with a killing spree that started in 1987 when he was just 19 years old. In May of that year, Kirkland beat his girlfriend, Leola Douglas, to death with a cinder block in a vacant lot, then set her body on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence. He was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and served 16 years in prison, being released in 2003 despite warnings from corrections officials about his dangerous psychological profile. The Ohio Parole Board's decision to free Kirkland would prove catastrophic. Between 2006 and 2009, Kirkland murdered 4 more people. Casonia Crawford, a 14-year-old girl he burned alive in 2006, Kimya Rollison, a 25-year-old woman he strangled in 2007, and finally, in 2009, 13-year-old Mary Jo Newton and 14-year-old Esme Kenny, both of whom he attacked while they were jogging or walking in their Cincinnati neighborhoods. The investigation into Esme Kenny's disappearance on March 7, 2009, finally broke the case open when police, using cell phone tracking, located Kirkland with her iPod and other belongings. During interrogation, he confessed to all 5 murders, providing details only the killer could know. The trial of Anthony Kirkland began in 2010 and became a referendum on Ohio's handling of violent offenders. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, and the jury convicted him on multiple counts of aggravated murder with death specifications for the murders of Casonia Crawford and Esme Kenny. During the penalty phase, the defense argued that Kirkland's traumatic brain injuries, childhood abuse, and mental illness should spare him execution. The jury disagreed, and in 2010, Kirkland was sentenced to death. What made his case nationally significant, however, was the subsequent legal battle. In 2014, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld his death sentence but noted serious concerns about the adequacy of his legal representation during the penalty phase. Kirkland's new attorneys argued that his original counsel had failed to present sufficient mitigating evidence about his traumatic childhood, including documented instances of severe physical abuse, neglect, and possible brain damage from multiple head injuries. The case worked its way through federal appeals, and in 2018, the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals ordered a new sentencing hearing, finding that Kirkland's constitutional rights had been violated. This decision created a firestorm in Ohio legal circles and prompted state legislators to propose changes to the appeals process for death penalty cases. In 2021, after years of litigation, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear Ohio's appeal of the 6th Circuit's decision, effectively mandating a new sentencing hearing. As of 2024, Kirkland remains on death row at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown, with his resentencing still pending. The broader impact of his case has been substantial. Ohio lawmakers have since restricted parole board discretion in cases involving violent sexual offenses and murders, requiring more extensive psychological evaluations and victim impact considerations. The Cincinnati Police Department overhauled its missing persons protocols, particularly for teenagers, implementing faster Amber Alert criteria and improved coordination between patrol units and detectives. Perhaps most significantly, Kirkland's case contributed to ongoing debates about the death penalty in Ohio, which has not executed anyone since 2018 due to difficulties obtaining lethal injection drugs and concerns about execution protocols. For the families of Leola Douglas, Casonia Crawford, Kimya Rollison, Mary Jo Newton, and Esme Kenny, the legal proceedings have provided little closure. Esme Kenny's mother, Lisa Kenny, became an advocate for stronger monitoring of sex offenders and violent parolees, testifying before the Ohio General Assembly about the failures that allowed Kirkland to remain free despite his clear danger to the community. The Esme Kenny Foundation, established in her memory, now provides self-defense training and safety education to young women in the Cincinnati area. Anthony Kirkland's name has become synonymous in Ohio with the dangers of insufficient parole oversight and the enduring questions about whether any amount of rehabilitation can truly reform certain violent offenders. Number 2, Ariel Castro, whose decade-long imprisonment of 3 women in a Cleveland house of horrors exposed devastating failures in Ohio's missing persons investigation protocols and neighbor reporting systems. On May 6, 2013, a frantic 911 call from a Seymour Avenue address in Cleveland's Tremont neighborhood ended a nightmare that had lasted nearly 11 years for 3 women who had been abducted, imprisoned, and repeatedly tortured in a seemingly ordinary 2-story house. Amanda Berry, 27, escaped through a front door that her captor had carelessly left unlocked, carrying her 6-year-old daughter and screaming for help from neighbors who had long ignored the strange occurrences at 2207 Seymour Avenue. Michelle Knight, 32, and Gina De Jesus, 23, followed her to freedom, emerging from a basement dungeon where they had been chained, beaten, starved, and subjected to unspeakable abuse since their respective abductions in 2002, 2003, and 2004. The man responsible, Ariel Castro, was a 52-year-old school bus driver who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, known to residents as a quiet, if somewhat odd, musician who played bass in local Latin bands. His capture and the subsequent revelations about his crimes would force Ohio to confront uncomfortable questions about how 3 missing persons cases could go unsolved for so long, despite multiple opportunities for intervention by law enforcement and social services. Castro's criminal history prior to the abductions was relatively minor, consisting of domestic violence allegations from a former common-law wife, Grimilda Figueroa, who had repeatedly sought protection from his abuse. In 2005, Figueroa had obtained a protection order against Castro, alleging that he had broken her nose, ribs, and arm, and had threatened to kill her and her children. The order was eventually dropped when Figueroa failed to appear at a hearing, a common occurrence in domestic violence cases that often leaves victims unprotected. This pattern of violence against women would prove to be a chilling precursor to Castro's eventual crimes. The abductions themselves were calculated and predatory. Michelle Knight, 21 years old at the time, disappeared on August 23, 2002, after leaving a cousin's house in Cleveland. She was not reported missing for several hours, and initial police response was characterized as inadequate by her family. Amanda Berry, 16, vanished on April 21, 2003, while walking home from her job at a Burger King just before her 17th birthday. Her case received significant media attention, and her mother, Lawana Miller, became a prominent advocate for missing children, appearing on national television programs and maintaining hope that her daughter would be found alive. Miller died in 2006, still believing Amanda was alive but never learning the truth. Gina De Jesus, 14, was the youngest victim, abducted on April 2, 2004, while walking home from school. Her disappearance galvanized the west side of Cleveland, with extensive community searches and sustained media coverage that, like Berry's case, yielded no concrete leads. Inside the house on Seymour Avenue, Castro had constructed an elaborate prison. The women were initially kept in separate locked rooms, chained to walls or furniture, and denied basic human dignity. Over time, Castro's control mechanisms evolved, incorporating psychological manipulation, forced pregnancies, and a twisted domestic arrangement where he occasionally allowed them limited freedom within the house while maintaining absolute authority. Amanda Berry gave birth to a daughter, Jocelyn, in 2006, delivered in an inflatable pool by Michelle Knight, who had received no medical training and was threatened with death if the baby did not survive. Jocelyn's existence remained unknown to the outside world until the escape. The investigation into Castro following the rescue revealed multiple missed opportunities for discovery. In 2004, police had responded to a call about a naked woman crawling in the backyard of Castro's home, but officers left without investigating further when no one answered the door. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises from the house, seeing women in the windows, and observing Castro's peculiar behavior, but no one contacted police with sufficient specificity to trigger a thorough investigation. The Cleveland Division of Police's handling of the missing persons cases was subsequently criticized in a 2013 review by the United States Department of Justice, which found that the department had failed to adequately prioritize the cases, coordinate between units, or follow up on potential leads. Castro was arrested on May 6, 2013, and quickly confessed to the abductions and Chojin, providing graphic details that investigators described as among the most disturbing they had encountered. He was charged with 4 counts of kidnapping and 3 counts of rape, with additional charges added as the investigation continued. On July 26, 2013, Castro pleaded guilty to 937 criminal counts, including aggravated murder for terminating Michelle Knight's pregnancies through beatings and starvation, in a deal that spared him the death penalty but ensured he would never leave prison. The sentencing hearing on August 1, 2013, provided a forum for the victims to confront their tormentor directly. Michelle Knight's testimony was particularly powerful, describing years of abuse and asserting her survival as an act of defiance. Castro, for his part, attempted to minimize his crimes, claiming that the women had consented to their confinement and that he was not a monster. Cuyahoga County Court Judge Michael Russo responded with a sentence of life in prison plus 1,000 years without parole, telling Castro that he would never see the light of day as a free man. The case appeared concluded, but Castro would not survive to serve his sentence. On September 3, 2013, he was found hanging in his cell at the Correctional Reception Center in Orient, Ohio, having committed suicide using a bed sheet. Prison officials determined that he had died of asphyxiation and had left notes indicating remorse for his actions. The suicide prompted investigations into prison suicide prevention protocols and whether Castro had received adequate mental health monitoring. The legal and policy aftermath of the Castro case extended far beyond his death. Ohio substantially revised its missing persons investigation procedures, implementing the Mandaberry Law in 2014, which requires law enforcement to immediately enter information about missing children into national databases and to coordinate with federal agencies. The Cleveland Police Department underwent significant reforms, including the creation of a dedicated missing persons unit and improved training for officers responding to domestic violence calls. The house on Seymour Avenue was demolished in August 2013 at the request of the victims, with Amanda Berry, Gina De Jesus, and Michelle Knight present to witness its destruction. The site remains vacant, a physical reminder of the horror that unfolded there. For the 3 survivors, the path forward has been marked by remarkable resilience. Amanda Berry and Gina De Jesus co-authored a book, Hope, a memoir of survival in Cleveland, published in 2015, and have become advocates for missing persons and victims of human trafficking. Michelle Knight, who later changed her name to Lily Rose Lee, published her own memoir, Finding Me, and has worked as a motivational speaker and advocate for abuse survivors. The Ariel Castro case stands as one of the most disturbing criminal episodes in Ohio history, not merely for the duration and depravity of the crimes, but for the systemic failures that allowed them to continue undetected for so long. It remains a touchstone for debates about police accountability, community responsibility, and the enduring capacity for evil to hide in plain sight. Number 3, Ronald Phillips, whose execution became the focal point for Ohio's ongoing struggle with lethal injection protocols and the ethics of capital punishment in the 21st century. Ronald Phillips was convicted of the 1993 rape and murder of his girlfriend's 3-year-old daughter, Sheila Marie Evans, a crime so brutal that it would define his legacy and become intertwined with Ohio's broader debates about the death penalty and execution methods. Born in 1973 in Akron, Ohio, Phillips had a troubled childhood marked by abuse and instability, factors that his defense attorneys would later emphasize in appeals, though they would prove insufficient to overcome the horror of his crime. On January 18, 1993, Phillips was babysitting Sheila Marie at her mother's apartment in Akron when he sexually assaulted the child so violently that she suffered fatal internal injuries. When Sheila Marie's mother, Faye Amanda Evans, returned home, she found her daughter unconscious and bleeding. Phillips initially claimed that the child had fallen, but medical examination revealed injuries inconsistent with any accident. Sheila Marie died 2 days later at Akron Children's Hospital, and Phillips was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, rape, and felonious assault. The trial in Summit County Court in late 1993 was marked by harrowing testimony from medical professionals about the extent of Sheila Marie's injuries. Dr. William Cox, a pediatrician who treated the child, described injuries that he had rarely seen in his career, including severe tearing and hemorrhaging that indicated a violent sexual assault. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. During the penalty phase, prosecutors presented additional evidence of Phillips's pattern of abusive behavior toward Sheila Marie and her siblings, including testimony that he had previously burned the children with cigarettes and beaten them with belts. On November 2, 1993, the jury recommended death, and Judge Jane Bond sentenced Phillips to execution. For the next 24 years, Phillips's case wound through the labyrinth of state and federal appeals that characterized death penalty litigation in the United States. His attorneys argued ineffective assistance of counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, and constitutional violations in the sentencing phase, but successive courts upheld his conviction and sentence. What made Phillips's case nationally significant, however, was not the crime itself but the circumstances of his scheduled execution and its repeated postponements. Ohio's execution schedule had been disrupted since 2014, when the execution of Dennis McGuire using a new 2-drug combination of midazolam and hydromorphone resulted in a prolonged, apparently agonizing death that lasted approximately 24 minutes. McGuire gasped and snorted during the procedure, prompting lawsuits from death row inmates arguing that the state's lethal injection protocol constituted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment. Phillips was first scheduled for execution in February 2015, but Governor John Kasich granted a reprieve to allow time for the state to obtain new execution drugs. This began a pattern that would define Phillips's final years. Repeated scheduling and postponement as Ohio struggled to secure pharmaceutical sources willing to supply execution drugs. The national shortage of execution drugs had been precipitated by European pharmaceutical companies refusing to export drugs for lethal injection and American manufacturers imposing distribution restrictions to prevent their products from being used in executions. In 2017, Phillips was again scheduled for execution, this time for July 26. The date approached amid ongoing litigation about Ohio's proposed 3-drug protocol, which included midazolam, a sedative that had been implicated in multiple botched executions nationwide. Phillips's attorneys, joined by other death row inmates, argued that midazolam could not reliably produce unconsciousness, potentially subjecting prisoners to excruciating pain from the subsequent paralytic and heart-stopping drugs. The United States Supreme Court declined to intervene, and Phillips's execution appeared imminent. In a surprising development, Phillips requested permission to donate his organs, specifically his kidney to his mother and his heart to his sister, both of whom suffered from serious medical conditions. The request generated significant ethical debate about whether condemned prisoners should be permitted to donate organs and whether the timing of execution created coercive pressures that compromised informed consent. The Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction ultimately denied the request, citing logistical impossibilities and security concerns, but the controversy added another layer of complexity to an already fraught case. On July 26, 2017, Ronald Phillips was executed by lethal injection at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. The procedure, using a 3-drug protocol of midazolam, rocuronium bromide, and potassium chloride, took approximately 12 minutes. Witnesses reported that Phillips gasped briefly after the first drug was administered, but then appeared to lose consciousness. In his final statement, Phillips apologized to Sheila Marie's family and expressed hope that his execution would bring them closure. He was pronounced dead at 10:43 a.m. The execution proceeded without the visible complications that had characterized McGuire's death, though medical experts continued to debate whether midazolam provided adequate anesthesia to prevent suffering. The aftermath of Phillips's execution extended far beyond his individual case. Ohio has not executed anyone since 2018, when Robert Van Hook was put to death using the same 3-drug protocol. Governor Mike DeWine, who took office in 2019, has deferred all scheduled executions indefinitely, citing pharmaceutical companies' unwillingness to supply execution drugs without legal protections against public disclosure. This de facto moratorium has indefinitely delayed the sentences of more than 24 death row inmates and has intensified calls for legislative abolition of capital punishment in Ohio. For Sheila Marie Evans's family, the decades between the crime and the execution provided little peace. Her mother, Faye Amanda Evans, struggled with addiction and died in 2008, never having recovered from the trauma of her daughter's murder. Other family members attended Phillips's execution, with some expressing relief that the legal process had finally concluded and others questioning whether any execution could truly provide justice for a child so young and so brutally victimized. The case remains significant in Ohio legal history as the intersection point of capital punishment debates. The difficulty of obtaining execution drugs, the ethical questions surrounding organ donation by condemned prisoners, and the ongoing constitutional challenges to lethal injection protocols. Ronald Phillips's name is now referenced not primarily for his unspeakable crime, but for the systemic dysfunction his case revealed in Ohio's death penalty machinery. Number 4, Jeffrey Dahmer, whose Ohio origins and early crimes in Bath Township presaged the horrors that would later unfold in Milwaukee and forever changed how American law enforcement investigates missing persons from marginalized communities. While Jeffrey Dahmer is most commonly associated with Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he committed the majority of his murders and where he was ultimately apprehended in 1991, his criminal trajectory began in the affluent suburbs of Northeast Ohio, where his early violence and subsequent evasion of justice exposed critical failures in juvenile intervention and substance abuse treatment that would have devastating consequences. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey was still a toddler when his family relocated to Doylestown, Ohio, and then to the Bath Township area near Akron, where his father took a position as a research chemist. The Dahmer household was marked by tension between his parents, Joyce's recurrent illnesses, and Lionel's emotional distance, factors that have been extensively analyzed but remain insufficient to fully explain the development of Jeffrey's profound psychological disturbances. Throughout his adolescence in Ohio, Dahmer exhibited increasingly disturbing behaviors that were noticed but never effectively addressed by the adults in his life. He collected animal carcasses, dissolving them in chemicals his father provided for supposed scientific exploration. He began drinking heavily in high school, consuming alcohol before classes at Revere High School, where he was generally regarded as an odd but unthreatening student. His parents' bitter divorce in 1978, finalized shortly after his graduation, left Dahmer alone in the family home while his mother moved to Wisconsin with his younger brother, David, and his father established a new relationship. This isolation in the summer of 1978 coincided with Dahmer's first murder. On June 18, 1978, Dahmer picked up Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker, and brought him to the Bath Township house with the promise of drinking and companionship. When Hicks attempted to leave, Dahmer struck him with a barbell and then strangled him with the barbell itself. He dismembered Hicks's body in the basement, later scattering the remains in the woods behind the property. The murder went undiscovered for nearly a decade, with Dahmer offering various explanations for Hicks's disappearance when questioned by the young man's concerned family. What is particularly significant about the Hicks murder from an Ohio justice perspective is not merely that it remained unsolved, but that Dahmer came to police attention multiple times in subsequent years without triggering serious investigative attention. In 1982, Dahmer was arrested for disorderly conduct at a Ramada Inn in Akron after exposing himself to a group of children and adults. He received a suspended sentence and probation, with no connection made to the still-missing Stephen Hicks. In 1986, he was arrested again in Bath Township for masturbating in front of two 12-year-old boys, receiving another suspended sentence and probation with mandatory counseling. The treatment he received, at the Association for the Psychiatric Treatment of Offenders, was focused on his substance abuse and sexual exhibitionism rather than his underlying homicidal ideation. There was no investigation into his potential involvement in Hicks's disappearance, despite his demonstrated pattern of predatory behavior toward young men. Dahmer's Ohio connections extended beyond these early crimes. His grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, lived in West Allis, Wisconsin, and it was to her home that Jeffrey moved in 1981 after his brief, failed attempt at college and military service. His Ohio family remained in contact with him throughout his Wisconsin years, with Lionel Dahmer maintaining regular correspondence and visits. When Jeffrey was finally arrested in 1991, his father immediately retained attorneys and became involved in the legal proceedings, eventually co-authoring a book about his experiences as the parent of a serial killer. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer in Milwaukee in 1992 was a media sensation that largely overshadowed the Ohio origins of his violence. He was eventually convicted of 15 murders in Wisconsin and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, with a 16th murder conviction in Ohio for the Hicks killing added in 1992 after he confessed and led police to scattered remains. The Wisconsin sentence ensured he would never be eligible for parole. The Ohio conviction was largely symbolic, though it provided some closure for the Hicks family. Dahmer would not survive long in prison. On November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, while performing cleaning duty. Scarver claimed that God had instructed him to kill Dahmer, and he also murdered another inmate, Jesse Anderson, in the same attack. The circumstances of Dahmer's death prompted reviews of prison security protocols for high-profile inmates. The policy implications of Dahmer's Ohio years became apparent only in retrospect. The failure to connect his early offenses to more serious criminal potential, the inadequacy of the counseling he received, and the lack of communication between different jurisdictions where he committed offenses all contributed to his continued freedom. In response to these failures, Ohio implemented improved information sharing between law enforcement agencies, more comprehensive evaluation protocols for sex offenders, and mandatory reporting requirements for mental health professionals who identify potentially dangerous patients. The most significant change, however, came in how missing persons cases involving marginalized individuals were investigated. Hicks, a hitchhiker with no fixed address, had not been prioritized by Ohio investigators in 1978. Similarly, Dahmer's later victims in Milwaukee, predominantly young men of color, many of whom were involved in sex work or experiencing homelessness, were not initially treated with urgency by Milwaukee police. The families of these victims, particularly the mother of Conorak Synthesumphone, a 14-year-old Laotian boy whom Dahmer had previously drugged and who was returned to Dahmer's custody by Milwaukee police despite his incoherent state, became vocal advocates for reform. The result was the implementation of community liaison programs, improved response protocols for reports of missing adults, and training for officers on implicit bias in missing persons investigations. For the families of Stephen Hicks and Dahmer's Wisconsin victims, the legal proceedings provided partial answers but little comfort. Hicks's parents, Richard and Martha Hicks, had maintained hope for years that their son might be found alive, and the confirmation of his murder compounded their grief. In civil litigation, they received a settlement from Lionel Dahmer's insurance company, though no amount of compensation could address their loss. The house in Bath Township where Hicks was murdered was sold and eventually demolished, with subsequent owners reporting that the property attracted uncomfortable attention from true crime enthusiasts. Jeffrey Dahmer's Ohio origins remain an essential, if often overlooked, component of understanding his criminal development. The missed opportunities for intervention in the 1970s and 1980s, the systemic failures that allowed him to continue offending, and the subsequent reforms his case prompted all demonstrate how local criminal justice failures can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate jurisdiction. For Ohio, the Dahmer case serves as a permanent reminder of the costs of inadequate juvenile intervention and the importance of taking seriously the warning signs of emerging violent offenders. Number 5. Robert N. Berdella, whose torture and murder of young men in Kansas City had significant Ohio connections through his origins and his victims, and whose case influenced sex offender registration and monitoring protocols across state lines, including Ohio. Robert Andrew Berdella was born on January 31, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, a suburb of Akron, where his early life suggested not a future serial killer, but rather a troubled young man struggling with anger issues and emerging sadistic sexual fantasies. His family operated a successful furniture business, and Berdella attended Cuyahoga Falls High School, where he was regarded as intelligent but socially isolated. His father died suddenly of a heart attack when Robert was 16, an event that family members later identified as a significant turning point in his psychological development. After high school, Berdella enrolled at the Kansas City Art Institute, leaving Ohio behind but carrying with him the psychological damage that would manifest in horrific violence. In Kansas City, Missouri, Berdella established himself as a business owner, opening Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, a shop in the city's Westport neighborhood that sold antiques, jewelry, and increasingly, occult items. He became involved in the local gay community, though his relationships were characterized by dominance, cruelty, and eventual violence. Between 1984 and 1987, Berdella abducted, tortured, and murdered at least 6 young men, though he suspected of additional victims. His methods were extraordinarily brutal. He kept his victims captive for days or weeks, subjecting them to electrical torture, drugging, sexual assault, and psychological degradation. He documented his crimes with detailed logs and photographs, creating a record of suffering that would become crucial evidence at his trial. The victims with Ohio connections were particularly significant to the case's interstate implications. Jerry Howell, age 20, was a Kansas City man but had family ties to Ohio that complicated initial missing persons investigations. Robert Sheldon, age 18, had been reported missing from his home in Wyoming but had Ohio connections through extended family. Most significantly, Larry Wayne Pearson, age 20, had a criminal record in Ohio and Missouri, and his disappearance initially drew little attention from law enforcement on either side of the state line. The failure to identify connections between missing persons reports in different jurisdictions allowed Berdella to continue his crimes with minimal scrutiny. The investigation that finally ended Berdella's killing spree began on March 29, 1988, when a young man named Christopher Bryson escaped from Berdella's house by jumping from a second-floor window. Bryson, naked and wearing only a dog collar, ran to a nearby payphone and contacted police, describing torture, rape, and imprisonment that authorities initially found almost unbelievable. When detectives executed a search warrant at 4315 Charlotte Street, they discovered a house of horrors. Human remains in the backyard, torture implements throughout the residence, and Berdella's meticulous records of his crimes. The discovery immediately raised questions about how such extensive criminal activity could have gone undetected in a residential neighborhood, and why missing persons reports for several victims had not triggered earlier investigation. Berdella was arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including his own documented confessions and photographs, he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. On December 19, 1988, Berdella pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the death of Larry Wayne Pearson and was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for 25 years. He subsequently pleaded guilty to additional murder charges and received further life sentences. The trial and its aftermath had significant implications for Ohio and Missouri law enforcement cooperation. Investigations revealed that Berdella had traveled between the states regularly, that some of his victims had criminal records or missing persons reports in Ohio, and that no systematic mechanism existed to share this information across state lines. In response, Ohio and Missouri implemented improved interstate criminal history sharing, particularly for missing persons and sex crimes. The Midwest Regional Information Sharing Initiative, established in 1992 with Ohio as a founding participant, was partly motivated by the failures exposed in the Berdella case. Berdella's case also influenced Ohio's approach to sex offender monitoring. His detailed documentation of his crimes, including his stated motivations of sexual gratification through dominance and torture, contributed to the professional literature on sexual sadism and its relationship to serial murder. Ohio's sex offender treatment programs, particularly those implemented after the 1990s, incorporated assessment protocols for sadistic fantasies and torture ideation that were developed in part from analysis of offenders like Berdella. In prison, Berdella became a minor cause célèbre for his complaints about conditions and his continued assertions that he had been unfairly characterized. He corresponded with journalists and academics, seeking to present himself as a misunderstood figure rather than the torturer documented in his own records. On October 8, 1992, Berdella was found dead in his cell at the Missouri State Penitentiary, having suffered a heart attack. The circumstances were unremarkable. After 4 years of incarceration, his body simply failed. For the families of his victims, his death provided little satisfaction. The torture and murder of their sons, brothers, and partners remained incomprehensible, and the knowledge that Berdella had documented their suffering added a layer of permanent violation to their grief. Several families pursued civil litigation against Berdella's estate, though recovery was limited. The house at 4315 Charlotte Street was eventually demolished, and the site has remained vacant. In Kansas City, the case contributed to neighborhood watch programs, and improved police-community relations in the Westport area. In Ohio, it reinforced the importance of recognizing that violent offenders may originate from unremarkable suburban backgrounds and that early intervention for adolescents with emerging sadistic sexual interests, while difficult and controversial, may prevent future harm. Robert Berdella's Ohio origins are often overshadowed by his Missouri crimes, but his case remains significant for the interstate legal and investigative reforms it prompted, and for its demonstration of how predators can operate across jurisdictional boundaries, exploiting the gaps in information sharing that existed before modern database systems. Number 6. Charles Manson, whose brief but consequential presence in Ohio connected the state's criminal history to one of the most infamous criminal conspiracies in American history and influenced subsequent cult and organized crime investigations nationwide. Charles Millis Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to 16-year-old Kathleen Maddox, a young woman with a history of petty crime and substance abuse who would prove unable to provide stable care for her son. Manson's birth certificate initially listed no name Maddox, with the surname Manson derived from William Manson, whom Kathleen briefly married. The circumstances of his Ohio infancy were chaotic. Kathleen's criminal activities continued, and she was eventually sentenced to prison for robbery, leaving young Charles in the care of relatives and, increasingly, the juvenile justice system. This early institutionalization would establish patterns of manipulation, victimhood, and violence that characterized Manson's entire life. The Ohio period of Manson's life was relatively brief but significant. His maternal grandmother, Nancy Maddox, lived in McMecken, West Virginia, across the Ohio River from Ohio, and young Charles was frequently shuttled between relatives on both sides of the river. His first documented criminal offense occurred in Indiana, but his psychological development was shaped by the instability of his Ohio Valley childhood. By age 9, he was already engaging in theft and truancy, behaviors that escalated through his adolescence and into a lifetime of incarceration interrupted only by brief periods of freedom during which he committed increasingly serious crimes. Manson's significance to Ohio criminal history is primarily retrospective. During his actual time in the state, he was merely one of thousands of children failed by inadequate social services and a juvenile justice system that punished without rehabilitating. However, his subsequent notoriety has prompted examination of how Ohio's systems contributed to his development and what lessons might be applied to prevent similar trajectories. The Tate LaBianca murders of August 1969, which made Manson infamous, seemed distant from his Ohio origins, but connections persisted. Manson maintained contacts in the Ohio Valley throughout his criminal career, and investigations following the murders examined whether he had established any similar communes or followings in the areas of his childhood. No significant Ohio connections to the Manson family crimes were discovered, but the possibility prompted Ohio law enforcement to develop protocols for investigating cult activity that proved valuable in subsequent cases. Manson's trial in 1970 and 1971 was a media spectacle that established precedents for handling high-profile criminal cases with significant public attention. Ohio prosecutors and judges studied the proceedings, particularly the challenges of managing multiple defendants, dealing with disruptive courtroom behavior, and addressing the media coverage that threatened to prejudice the jury pool. These lessons were applied in Ohio's own high-profile cases, including the trials arising from the 1970 Kent state shootings and various organized crime prosecutions in Cleveland. The legal aftermath of the Manson case extended to Ohio through the development of conspiracy law. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi's theory of vicarious liability, in which Manson was held responsible for murders he did not personally commit based on his leadership of a criminal conspiracy, was closely analyzed by Ohio legal scholars and incorporated into Ohio's criminal statutes. The state's complicity and conspiracy provisions, revised in 1974, reflected the understanding that criminal organizations, whether formal like the Mafia or informal like the Manson family, required specific legal frameworks for prosecution. Manson's imprisonment from 1971 until his death in 2017 provided ongoing opportunities for examination of his psychological development and its Ohio roots. Multiple biographers interviewed Ohio residents who had known young Charles, reconstructing a childhood of neglect, abuse, and institutional failure. These investigations contributed to understanding of how extreme childhood trauma can produce adult psychopathy, though they offered little in the way of practical prevention strategies. For correctional officials in Ohio, Manson represented a case study in managing high-profile, manipulative inmates. His ability to maintain influence over followers from prison, to attract media attention, and to present himself as a victim of persecution rather than a perpetrator of violence required specific management strategies. Ohio's maximum security protocols, particularly for inmates with cult leader characteristics, were influenced by analysis of Manson's prison career. Manson died on November 19, 2017, at California State Prison, Corcoran, at age 83, having been denied parole 12 times. His death prompted renewed media attention and examination of his legacy, including his brief Ohio childhood. The Cincinnati neighborhood where he was born has no marker of this history, a deliberate choice by residents who wished not to be associated with his crimes. Charles Manson's Ohio origins serve as a footnote to his criminal biography rather than a central element, but they remain significant for what they reveal about the limitations of juvenile intervention in the 1930s and 1940s, and about how early childhood trauma, when unaddressed, can produce adult monstrosity. For Ohio's criminal justice system, his case provides distant but real examples of the costs of inadequate child welfare and the importance of early intervention, even when the prospects for success appear limited. Number 7. Donald Harvey, the mild-mannered hospital worker from southwestern Ohio who became one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, murdering patients across multiple states and exposing catastrophic failures in medical institution oversight. Donald Harvey was born on April 15, 1952, in Butler County, Ohio, the largest county in the Cincinnati metropolitan area, and spent his entire life in the region, establishing a pattern of employment in healthcare facilities that would enable decades of undetected murder. Harvey's childhood was marked by physical abuse from his father and sexual abuse by an uncle, traumas that he would later cite as contributing factors to his psychological disturbance, though they cannot fully explain the systematic cruelty of his crimes. By his own eventual admission, Harvey committed his first murder at age 18 in 1970, while working as an orderly at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky, just across the state line from Ohio. He would continue killing for the next 17 years, with his crimes accelerating in frequency and brazenness as he moved between healthcare facilities in Ohio and Kentucky, always finding new victims and always avoiding serious suspicion. Harvey's methods were varied and deliberately obscured. He used cyanide, arsenic, insulin overdoses, suffocation with plastic bags and pillows, and deliberate oxygen cutoffs for patients on ventilators. This variety served both practical and psychological purposes, preventing easy detection through consistent symptoms while allowing Harvey to experiment with different means of killing. He described experiencing sexual gratification from the act of murder and from the power of life and death over vulnerable patients, motivations that placed him in the category of medical serial killers driven by sadistic pleasure rather than the more common angel of death profile of killers motivated by mercy or delusion. Harvey's Ohio employment history reads like a tour of the state's healthcare system. After Marymount Hospital, he worked at Cincinnati's Good Samaritan Hospital, Drake Memorial Hospital, and the Cincinnati VA Medical Center. At each facility, patients died at elevated rates during his shifts, yet no systematic investigation occurred. Healthcare institutions of this era lacked the data analysis capabilities to identify patterns of suspicious deaths, and individual physicians generally attributed unexpected fatalities to underlying medical conditions rather than considering homicide. The culture of medical deference, in which doctors' judgments went unquestioned and orderlies like Harvey were invisible, created perfect conditions for his crimes. The investigation that finally exposed Harvey began not with patient deaths but with a theft. In 1987, officials at Drake Memorial Hospital discovered that Harvey had stolen body parts from the morgue for use in occult rituals, a bizarre sideline to his murderous activities that suggested profound psychological disturbance. He was fired but not reported to law enforcement or nursing regulators, yet another failure of institutional accountability. Harvey simply moved to another position at the Cincinnati VA Medical Center, where he continued killing. The definitive break in the case came from a medical examiner's curiosity. In March 1987, Dr. Daniel R. Brown, the Hamilton County coroner, performed an autopsy on John Powell, a patient at the VA Medical Center who had died unexpectedly. Dr. Brown detected the odor of cyanide during the autopsy, a finding so unusual that he ordered toxicological testing despite the absence of any initial suspicion of foul play. The tests confirmed cyanide poisoning, and investigation quickly focused on Harvey, who had been Powell's primary caregiver. Confronted with evidence, Harvey confessed not merely to Powell's murder but to dozens of others, providing details that would astonish investigators. His eventual admissions encompassed at least 37 confirmed murders, with Harvey claiming responsibility for up to 87 deaths in total. The confirmed victims included 21 at Marymount Hospital, 12 at Drake Memorial Hospital, and additional deaths at other facilities. The geographic spread of his crimes across Kentucky and Ohio complicated prosecution, but Hamilton County prosecutors secured indictments for multiple murders in Ohio. Harvey's trial was rendered unnecessary by his comprehensive guilty pleas. On August 20, 1987, he pleaded guilty to 24 counts of aggravated murder in Kentucky and received 8 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years. In Ohio, he pleaded guilty to 15 murders and received additional life sentences. The plea agreements ensured that Harvey would die in prison while sparing victims' families the trauma of trial testimony. The legal and institutional aftermath of Harvey's crimes was extensive. Ohio implemented mandatory reporting requirements for healthcare facilities regarding unusual patient deaths, established databases to track employment histories of healthcare workers, and created joint investigation protocols between medical examiners and law enforcement. The federal government, prompted in part by the Harvey case, established the Healthcare Integrity and Protection Data Bank, a national registry of adverse actions against healthcare providers. For the families of Harvey's victims, the revelations brought complex emotions. Many had grieved their loved ones' deaths as natural, only to learn they had been murdered. Some felt guilt for not having suspected, others anger at the institutions that had failed to protect their family members. Civil litigation against the various hospitals resulted in numerous settlements, with institutions paying to avoid the publicity of trial disclosure about their negligence. Harvey's own post-conviction life was unremarkable. He gave occasional interviews, expressing what appeared to be genuine remorse while also displaying the flattened affect and self-pity characteristic of psychopathic personalities. On March 28, 2017, he was found severely beaten in his cell at the Toledo Correctional Institution and died 2 days later at a local hospital. His killer, fellow inmate James Elliott, was a violent offender with no known connection to Harvey's victims. The attack appeared to be opportunistic rather than retributive. Donald Harvey's case remains the most significant medical serial murder case in Ohio history and one of the most important in American criminal justice. It exposed the vulnerability of healthcare institutions to predatory employees, the failure of professional licensing systems to track dangerous practitioners, and the cultural barriers that prevented recognition of homicide in medical settings. The reforms his case prompted, while imperfect, have undoubtedly saved lives by making such systematic medical murder more difficult to perpetrate undetected. Number 8. Thomas Dillon, the Ohio outdoorsman whose secret life as a serial killer terrorized rural communities and fundamentally changed how law enforcement investigates geographically dispersed murder patterns. Thomas D. Dillon was born on July 9, 1950, in Wheeling, West Virginia, but his family moved to Belmont County, Ohio when he was young, and he would spend most of his life in the Appalachian region of eastern Ohio, developing the outdoor skills and knowledge of remote terrain that would enable his murders. Dillon graduated from Belmont Technical College and worked various jobs, most notably as a draftsman for the Ohio Department of Transportation and as a pilot for aerial photography companies. To his neighbors in Muskingum County, where he eventually settled, Dillon was a quiet, unassuming man with a passion for photography and the outdoors, married with a son, and generally unremarkable in every respect. Beneath this ordinary facade, however, Dillon harbored violent fantasies that he began acting upon in 1989, when he was 39 years old. Between April 1989 and April 1992, Dillon murdered 5 men in rural areas of eastern Ohio, with a 6th murder in Pennsylvania that would only be confirmed after his capture. His victims were all strangers, selected opportunistically during Dillon's outdoor expeditions. Donald Welling, shot while jogging on April 1, 1989. Jamie Paxton, a 21-year-old stabbed and shot while hiking on October 10, 1990. Claude Hawkins, shot while fishing on March 29, 1991. Donald Posey, shot while hunting on November 1, 1991. And Gary Bradley, shot while hiking on April 5, 1992. The fifth murder provoked the investigation that would eventually identify Dillon. Kevin Loring, shot while birdwatching in Maine in May 1991, survived and provided a description of his attacker, though this information would not connect to Dillon for nearly a year. The geographic dispersion of Dillon's crimes, spanning multiple counties and eventually crossing state lines, created significant investigative challenges. Rural sheriff's departments, operating with limited resources and without sophisticated communication systems, initially failed to recognize connections between the murders. Victims were found in different jurisdictions, with different apparent circumstances, and no obvious motive connected them. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: Dillon's own compulsion to communicate. In 1990, he began writing anonymous letters to a local newspaper, the Belmont Gazette, describing some of his murders with details known only to the killer. These letters, analyzed by FBI behavioral profilers, suggested an intelligent, organized offender with a need for recognition, but they provided no direct identification. The FBI's involvement increased as the murder count rose and the geographic scope expanded. Behavioral analysis suggested a white male, 30 to 40 years old, with extensive outdoor knowledge and a stable employment history that allowed extensive time in rural areas. This profile, while accurate, fit thousands of men in eastern Ohio. The critical identification came from firearms analysis. Bullets recovered from several victims were determined to have been fired from a high-powered rifle of a specific type, and further investigation focused on gun purchases in the region. Dillon had purchased a Mauser rifle in 1983, and records indicated he had also owned other weapons consistent with the murder weapon. In November 1992, FBI agents arrested Dillon at his workplace in Zanesville, finding in his vehicle the murder weapon, ammunition, and maps marking the locations of his crimes. The interrogation and confession of Thomas Dillon revealed a psychology that investigators found both familiar and disturbing. Dillon described experiencing intense anger and fantasies of violence throughout his adult life, with the actual murders providing temporary relief from these impulses. He selected victims based on opportunity rather than specific characteristics, though he expressed particular resentment toward outdoorsmen whose enjoyment of nature he perceived as inauthentic compared to his own profound connection to the wilderness. His photography, which he had pursued seriously for years, included numerous images of his victims' locations taken before and after the murders, a visual record of his criminal activities that paralleled the documentation practices of other organized serial killers. Dillon was charged with 5 Ohio murders and the Pennsylvania murder of Keith Loring, with additional weapons and conspiracy charges. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence and his own detailed confessions, he pleaded guilty to all charges in 1993, receiving 5 consecutive sentences of 30 years to life in Ohio and an additional life sentence in Pennsylvania. The plea agreement ensured he would never be eligible for parole while sparing the victims' families the trauma of trial. The policy implications of the Dillon case were significant for Ohio and national law enforcement. The failure to initially recognize connections between geographically dispersed rural murders prompted development of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VCAP, a national database that allows law enforcement agencies to share information about similar crimes across jurisdictional boundaries. Ohio was an early adopter of VCAP protocols, and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation established dedicated units for pattern analysis in violent crime. More specifically, the Dillon case contributed to understanding of how serial murderers can operate in rural environments, where lower population density and limited law enforcement presence create opportunities for predation. Traditional serial murder profiles, developed largely from urban cases, emphasized prostitute victims and inner-city crime scenes. Dillon demonstrated that serial murder could emerge from entirely different contexts, requiring different investigative approaches. For Eastern Ohio communities, the Dillon case shattered perceptions of rural safety. The notion that violent predators required urban anonymity was disproven. Dillon had found his victims in the very spaces where residents sought solitude and connection with nature. Outdoor recreation practices changed, with increased caution about solitary activities in remote areas, and improved communication protocols for reporting suspicious encounters. Thomas Dillon died on October 21, 2011, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, of natural causes at age 61. He had given few interviews during his incarceration and had expressed no remorse for his crimes in the limited statements he did make. For the families of his victims, his death provided minimal comfort. The random, unmotivated nature of his violence meant that no explanation or resolution was possible. The case remains significant in criminology for its demonstration of how serial murder can emerge from unremarkable backgrounds and operate across rural landscapes, and for the investigative and database reforms it prompted that have undoubtedly prevented similar crime sprees from going undetected for so long. Number 9. The Rhoden Family Massacre, the largest homicide investigation in Ohio history that exposed the vulnerability of rural communities to organized criminal violence and prompted unprecedented interagency cooperation protocols. On April 22, 2016, in the remote community of Piketon in Pike County, Ohio, 8 members of the Rhoden family were discovered shot to death in 4 separate locations. Their bodies arranged in deliberate poses that suggested execution rather than spontaneous violence. The victims were Christopher Rhoden, Sr., 40, and his cousin, Gary Rhoden, 38, found at one location. Christopher's ex-wife, Dana Rhoden, 37, and their children, Clarence Frankie Rhoden, 20, and Hannah Mae Rhoden, 19, at another. Christopher's brother, Kenneth Rhoden, 44, at a third, and another brother, Chris Rhoden, Jr., 16, at a fourth. Hannah Mae Rhoden's 6-month-old daughter, Kylie, and Frankie Rhoden's 6-month-old son, Ruger, were found alive at the scenes, having been present during the murders of their mothers. The scale and methodical nature of the killings immediately distinguished this case from typical domestic or drug-related homicides, suggesting organized criminal involvement and deliberate planning. The investigation that followed would become the most extensive in Ohio history, involving the Pike County Sheriff's Office, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the Ohio Attorney General's Office, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, with total costs exceeding $1 million in the first year alone. The Rhoden family, while not prominent in any conventional sense, was well known in Pike County as a large, extended clan with involvement in various businesses, some legitimate and some of questionable legality. Christopher Rhoden, Sr., operated a commercial marijuana growing operation, an enterprise that investigators initially suspected might have motivated the murders, either as a territorial dispute or as retaliation for theft or cooperation with law enforcement. The family had other legal issues, including custody disputes and financial conflicts, that provided potential motives for various individuals. The crime scene evidence suggested military or law enforcement sophistication. The murders had been committed with suppressed weapons, leaving minimal ballistic evidence. The locations had been carefully selected for isolation, with the killers demonstrating knowledge of the victims' schedules and family relationships. The staging of bodies, including the placement of shell casings and the apparent deliberate sparing of infant witnesses, indicated controlled, purposeful violence rather than rage-driven killing. Despite extensive investigation, the case remained unsolved for more than 2 years, with no arrests and no public identification of suspects. The lack of progress generated significant community frustration and media criticism, with some suggesting that the rural, working-class status of the victims resulted in less investigative priority than high-profile cases involving more affluent victims. These criticisms were vehemently rejected by law enforcement officials, who cited the complexity of the case and the need to build an airtight prosecution rather than rush to arrest. The breakthrough came in November 2018, with the arrest of Jake Wagner, age 26, and his brother George Wagner IV, age 27, along with their parents Billy Wagner, age 47, and Angela Wagner, age 48. The family's residence in South Webster, Ohio, approximately 30 miles from Piketon, had been known to investigators early in the case, but building sufficient evidence for arrest had required extensive surveillance, forensic analysis, and cooperation from informants. The alleged motive, revealed in subsequent court proceedings, was stunning in its banality: a custody dispute. Jake Wagner had been in a relationship with Hannah Mae Rhoden and fathered her daughter, Kylie. When Hannah Mae ended the relationship and began seeing other men, the Wagner family allegedly developed a plan to eliminate the Rhoden family entirely ensuring that Jake Wagner would obtain sole custody of Kylie. This explanation, while legally sufficient as motive, struggled to account for the scale of violence, leading to speculation about additional motivations including drug trafficking rivalries that were never substantiated in court. The prosecution of the Wagner family proceeded strategically. Angela Wagner pleaded guilty in September 2021 to conspiracy and aggravated murder charges, agreeing to testify against her sons and husband in exchange for a sentence of 30 years with possibility of parole after 25 years. Her detailed testimony provided the narrative framework for the prosecution, describing months of planning, target practice, and acquisition of weapons and silencers. George Wagner IV went to trial in August 2022, with prosecutors presenting extensive physical evidence including shell casings matched to weapons purchased by the Wagners, cell phone location data placing the defendants near the crime scenes, and Wagner family communications discussing the murders. On December 19, 2022, the jury convicted George Wagner IV on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Jake Wagner had previously pleaded guilty in 2021 to 23 charges, including 8 counts of aggravated murder, in exchange for a sentence of life without parole and agreement not to appeal. Billy Wagner, the family patriarch, was tried separately and convicted in December 2022 of murder and conspiracy charges, receiving a sentence of life without parole. The legal and institutional aftermath of the Rhoden case has been substantial. Pike County, previously served by a small sheriff's office with limited investigative resources, received significant state funding for forensic capabilities and interagency cooperation protocols. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation established a dedicated major case unit specifically designed to coordinate responses to complex, multi-jurisdictional homicides. Perhaps most significantly, the case prompted Ohio to adopt Rhoden's Law, legislation that strengthens penalties for murder committed in the context of custody disputes and creates specific aggravating circumstances for murders of multiple family members. The law also established the Ohio Rural Violent Crime Response Protocol, ensuring that rural jurisdictions have immediate access to state and federal investigative resources without the delays that characterized the initial Rhoden investigation. For the surviving Rhoden family members and the Pike County community, healing has been slow and incomplete. The infants who survived the massacre, Kylie Rhoden and Ruger Rhoden, were placed in protective custody and eventually adopted by extended family members. Their early childhood marked by trauma they cannot remember but whose effects may persist. The Wagner family's farm was sold, with proceeds directed to victim compensation funds, but the physical sites of the murders remain, maintained by family members who have refused to abandon the land where their relatives died. The Rhoden family massacre stands as a dark demonstration of how rural isolation, while offering many benefits, can also enable organized violence that goes undetected until complete. It forced recognition that criminal sophistication is not limited to urban environments, and that effective law enforcement response requires resources and coordination that rural jurisdictions often lack. The reforms it prompted, while unable to restore the lives lost, may prevent similar tragedies through improved preparedness and interagency cooperation. Number 10. Richard Beasley, whose Craigslist killings exploited digital platforms to lure victims to rural Ohio execution sites, establishing precedents for how law enforcement investigates internet-facilitated murder and how platforms monitor for criminal exploitation. Richard James Beasley was born in 1959 in Akron, Ohio, and by 2011, at age 52, he had accumulated a criminal history including convictions for drug trafficking, prostitution promotion, and various fraud schemes, yet remained effectively invisible to law enforcement despite his escalating criminal sophistication. His prior offenses, while serious, had not involved violence, and his release from prison in 2004 after a drug conviction had not triggered intensive monitoring. Beasley had established himself in the Noble County area of rural southeastern Ohio, where his reputation as a street preacher and occasional mentor to troubled youth masked predatory intentions that would culminate in multiple murders. The case that would make Beasley infamous began with an advertisement posted on Craigslist in August 2011, offering employment as a caretaker on a 688-acre property in Noble County. The ad promised a peaceful rural existence, free housing, and a generous salary for someone willing to live on the remote property and perform light maintenance. The property itself did not exist, at least not as described. Beasley had no connection to any such land and no intention of providing employment. The advertisement was a lure, designed to attract vulnerable men with few employment prospects who might not be immediately missed if they disappeared. The first known respondent was Ralph Geiger, a 56-year-old man from Akron who had experienced financial difficulties and saw the caretaker position as opportunity for a fresh start. Geiger disappeared in August 2011. His body discovered months later in a shallow grave near Caldwell, Ohio. His death received limited attention initially. As an adult male without close family ties, his disappearance did not trigger immediate alarm or intensive investigation. The second victim, David Pauley, 51, responded to the same advertisement in October 2011. Pauley, from Norfolk, Virginia, had driven to Ohio believing he had secured legitimate employment. Like Geiger, he was shot and buried in a shallow grave. His disappearance was noted by family members, but the geographic distance and initial assumption that he had simply abandoned his previous life delayed serious investigation. The third victim, Timothy Kern, 47, from Massillon, Ohio, responded to a modified advertisement in November 2011. Kern, recently divorced and seeking new direction, was particularly vulnerable to the promise of rural solitude and meaningful work. He too was killed and buried in Noble County. What distinguished the Beasley case from other serial killings was the near miss that exposed the scheme. Scott Davis, 48, from South Carolina, responded to the advertisement and traveled to Ohio in November 2011. Meeting Beasley in a parking lot near Caldwell, Davis became suspicious when Beasley's description of the property was vague and inconsistent. When Beasley directed him to a remote wooded area, Davis recognized danger and fled. Beasley pursued him through the woods, firing a handgun, but Davis escaped and contacted police. Davis's report, initially treated with skepticism by some officers unfamiliar with internet-facilitated crime, eventually triggered investigation that connected him to the earlier disappearances. Cell phone records placed Beasley in communication with all four men, and investigation revealed that Beasley had used multiple false identities in placing the advertisements and communicating with respondents. The investigation quickly identified an accomplice. Brogan Rafferty, a 16-year-old high school student from Stowe, Ohio, whom Beasley had befriended and recruited into his scheme. Rafferty's involvement was complex. He had participated in the murders, including digging graves and disposing of evidence, but his age and Beasley's clear domination of their relationship raised questions about his culpability. Prosecutors charged both Beasley and Rafferty with aggravated murder, with Beasley facing the death penalty and Rafferty, as a juvenile, facing life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 25 years. The trial of Richard Beasley in January and February 2013 was marked by extensive evidence of his manipulation and the calculated nature of his crimes. Prosecutors detailed how Beasley had researched his victims through social media and background searches, selecting men who were isolated and unlikely to have immediate family notification of their disappearance. The murders themselves were executions. Beasley shot each victim in the head at close range, then stripped their bodies of identification and personal items before burial with Rafferty's assistance. The defense argued that Beasley's life history of abuse, poverty, and addiction had produced psychological damage that mitigated his culpability, but offered no alternative explanation for the evidence. On March 12, 2013, the jury convicted Beasley on all counts, and on March 20 they recommended death. Judge Lynn Callahan imposed the death sentence on April 4, 2013. Brogan Rafferty, tried separately as a juvenile, was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with possibility of parole. His appeals focused on the appropriateness of treating a 16-year-old as an adult for sentencing purposes, questions that would become nationally significant as juvenile sentencing law evolved. The legal and policy aftermath of the Beasley case has been extensive and ongoing. The use of Craigslist as a murder weapon prompted the platform to implement enhanced monitoring of employment advertisements, including verification requirements for certain categories and automated flagging of potentially fraudulent postings. Law enforcement agencies, including the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, established dedicated cybercrime units specifically trained to investigate internet-facilitated offenses and to coordinate with platform security teams. Ohio's criminal statutes were amended to create specific penalties for using electronic communication to facilitate murder or kidnapping, with enhanced sentences for crimes involving exploitation of digital platforms. The Beasley Amendment to Ohio's aggravated murder statute, passed in 2014, establishes that murder committed through internet-facilitated deception constitutes prior calculation and design, an aggravating circumstance supporting capital charges. For the families of Beasley's victims, the legal proceedings provided accountability but little comfort. The random, predatory nature of the crimes meant that no precaution or awareness could have protected their loved ones. Ralph Geiger's family established a foundation supporting employment assistance for vulnerable adults, recognizing that the economic desperation that had made him susceptible to Beasley's scheme affected many others. David Pauly's children have become advocates for improved missing persons protocols, noting the delays in investigation that resulted from assumptions about voluntary disappearance. Richard Beasley remains on death row at the Ohio State Penitentiary, with his appeals focusing on procedural claims rather than substantive challenges to his guilt. His execution has been delayed by Ohio's ongoing difficulties with lethal injection supplies and the general de facto moratorium on executions since 2018. Whether he will ever face execution remains uncertain. His case, however, has already secured its place in criminal justice history as the definitive example of how digital platforms can be weaponized for murder, and how law enforcement must evolve to address criminal exploitation of technological innovation. The Beasley case closed one era of criminal investigation and opened another, demonstrating that the internet was not merely a new context for traditional crimes, but a fundamentally different environment requiring new investigative approaches, new legal frameworks, and new forms of cooperation between platforms and law enforcement.